Welcome back. This is the third session in our course on the formation of our Bible. And right now we're going to do a really quick session. This shouldn't take long at all. We're going to look at the Gospels, and then we will do the rest of the New Testament, or the New Testament as a whole. But I just wanted to take, this is just going to be really quick, and we're just going to look at the Gospels really quick. I should note that I've written, and you can find a link to this in the resources for this section. I've written an article that you can find on Growing in Messiah on what language the Synoptic Gospels were written in. Some people might not find that to be of interest at all. There has been a rise a little bit recently to say that the Synoptic Gospels, we'll talk about what that means in just a second, that the Synoptic Gospels were written in Aramaic or Hebrew. I reject this outright and think that that's not the case, and I've written on that, and you can find that article on Growing in Messiah. So if that's something that you're interested, I would encourage you to take the extra time for this installment and read that article. Otherwise, let's just jump right in, and this will be a quick one. The first written record of Jesus' life and ministry comes from the Synoptic Gospels, written around 60 CE. That's about, well, it's less than 30 years after Jesus was on earth. The word synoptic means to agree or take a common view. The title Synoptic Gospels refers to Matthew, Mark, and Luke because they are so similar in their narrative of Jesus' ministry. These accounts were written approximately 30 years after Jesus' resurrection and ascension. So one of the questions that instantly comes up would be, why is John so different? I would encourage you to ask your pastor about this, or talk about it maybe in your small group or something like that. But my belief, and the reason that I think it's so much different, is because by the time John writes sometime, I believe, in the 90s, and there is a little bit different opinion on when John wrote his gospel. I believe that John wrote in the 90s, and I think that he's writing specifically to combat things like Gnosticism, which is a heretical rise of a sect of Christianity. And so he's writing for a lot of theological purposes to put certain things to rest. I also believe that John expects his audience to have a knowledge and understanding of the Synoptic Gospels. I know that that's debated as well, but that's my understanding. So I think there are two different reasons, and I think that John already believes that his audience has written and understands the Synoptic Gospels. Okay. It is believed that many of the stories contained within the Gospels were known by oral retelling. So in other words, people had stories that they would tell to each other. And the culture in that time was very much of memory. So, they didn't have tape recorders. They didn't have, smartphones that could record things. They didn't have video cameras or anything like that. Obviously, what they did was they memorized a lot of different things. People didn't have books the way that we do today either. Books were very expensive. Scrolls were very expensive. So the average person didn't have access to a lot of this stuff. And so what they did was they would memorize and then they would retell. So I think, so when I say oral retelling, what I'm saying is that they would tell the stories to each other, and they would remember those stories, and that's how information was passed around. The orality of these accounts no doubt took on a fixed nature as hundreds of eyewitnesses continued to tell the story of Jesus' life and work. While orally transmitting stories might be foreign for us today, it was the common practice in the first century, and it seems accuracy was quite sharp. When it comes to the gospel stories, we must remember several things. Number one, when these gospel accounts were written, there were still hundreds of people still alive that were eyewitnesses to Jesus' story. And we see this in 1 Corinthians 15:6. Paul tells us that. It says, "Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep." If the gospel writers were stretching the truth or making up stories, we would expect other witnesses to come forward to challenge such claims. Luke 1:1-3 says, "Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us. It seems good to me all, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus. So Luke is compiling different stories, different tellings of the stories and making one account. Okay. The second reason is that the second thing about this is that it is widely accepted that the apostles of Jesus were martyred. It seems quite unlikely that 12 men would all be willing to give their lives simply to uphold a lie. Maybe one or two people, you tell a lie and, we saw this guy rise from the dead. Okay. But when you're talking about 12 people, John wasn't martyred, we don't believe so, but 11 guys willing to give their life for something that they made up? I don't think so. I think that one of them would have said, no, it was all just a lie. We just made it up. So that right there, the fact that they were martyred, tells us something. Number 3, we have 1st and 2nd century non-canonical literature that supports the life and death of Jesus. So there are writers that are not within the Bible that talk about Jesus, his ministry, and his death. So, for instance, the Jewish historian Josephus speaks about Jesus, his work, his death at the hands of the principal men of the Jews through Pilate, and that he appeared to his followers after his crucifixion, as the divine prophets had foretold. For those who would say, we can't take Josephus. I understand that Josephus is a historian. I know the controversies about some of the things Josephus has said and written. My only point is that we do have witness within Josephus. Another witness would be the Roman historian Tacitus, records in the Roman annals records that one called Christus was executed at the hands of Pontius Pilate, or Pontius Pilatus, and his followers, known as Christians, suffered horrendous martyrdom. So there's another witness outside of the Gospels. And we also need to remember that each one of the Gospels is a witness of itself. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they all are witnesses. In the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, a thing is established. Well, we have 4 witnesses of the life and death of Jesus in the Gospels. When it comes to the manuscripts of the Gospels, they are quite early. We have fragments of the Gospels from the 2nd century and a fragment of Mark dated to the 1st century. For instance, manuscript P75 contains all of Luke and John and is dated to 175 to 225 CE. So that's really quite early. We have the entire canon of the New Testament, along with some apocryphal books contained in Codex Sinaiticus, dated to the 4th century. It is one of the greatest historical finds of the 19th century. We'll talk about the finding of Codex Sinaiticus and why it's called Sinaiticus, and it's a fascinating and wonderful story. The orality of the gospel stories comes more into focus when we understand how the Synoptic Gospels were formed. The evidence of these unified pieces of work speak to a single tradition within the accounts. Now, this might sound technical, but let me explain this. This is known as the Synoptic Problem. And, what is the Synoptic Problem? The Synoptic Problem is the term used to describe the relationship between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So I'm going to use a quote here. In reading the 4 Gospels, it is apparent that 3 of them resemble one another and one does not. A brief time spent in any synopsis of the Gospels will indicate that Matthew, Mark, and Luke share a number of striking similarities. Sometimes even they say the exact same thing, word for word. So that's pretty incredible. The Synoptic Problem is the name that has been given to the problem of why the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke look so much alike. Why are they so similar in content, in wording, and in the order of events found within them? Most scholars today believe Mark wrote his gospel first and did so using a source text. And you might hear some people refer to Q, the text of Q. There are other, and I talk about this in the article that I wrote on what language the Synoptic Gospels were written in, and I talk about basically the Synoptic Problem and why we believe that there was some form of a source text. Whether or not it's Q or not, that's debatable, and I talk about that in that article, so I'd encourage you to go there and read that. So Mark is seen as the first gospel written for 5 reasons, okay? Number 1, Mark is the shortest gospel, and usually we would expect that if somebody is writing something and they're copying off somebody else, they're going to expand the story. They're not going to take stuff away from the story. They're going to remember more, and they're going to add to the story. So that's number 1. Number 2, Mark has the poorest Greek. And once again, we would expect that if you're copying off somebody and somebody makes a typo or they say something that is grammatically wrong, you usually fix it. You don't keep the bad language, the poor grammar, you fix it. So that's another reason. Number 3, Mark is frequently redundant. And once again, if you're copying off somebody and they're being redundant in something, usually you'll take that out to make the story smoother. Number 4, Mark is has harder readings. And so when we think of harder readings, we think of theology, things that are hard to explain theologically. And usually if somebody is copying something and they find something that is hard or sounds like a mistake or sounds like it's contradictory, what do? They fix it. And so that's another reason. And 5, the lack of Matthew, Luke verbal agreement against Mark. So I think that should be somewhat straightforward. In other words, Matthew and Luke verbally, they don't agree as much with each other as they do with Mark. That's the point. Okay. It should be noted that it is believed that all of the apostles except John were martyred. We might believe a person would be willing to die to uphold a lie, but to have 11 men willing to die for a story they made up is outside the realm of possible. The apostles believed the apostles believed what they preached, and the accounts of the Messiah they told with such conviction they were willing to give their lives for it. Okay, so I hope that sheds a little bit of light on the Synoptic Gospels. That's Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And in our next session, we will look at the New Testament and the rest of the New Testament as a whole. And we'll look at the canonization of the New Testament. I hope to see you then.